You're settling into your chair now, dear listeners, as autumn winds whisper through Paris streets where history's most infamous execution unfolded before thousands of eager eyes, forever changing how crowds view royal power. Picture October 16th, 1793. The Austrian queen, who allegedly said, "Let them eat cake," climbs wooden steps to the guillotine in Place de la Révolution, her hands bound with rough rope, hair roughly shorn by prison barbers, dressed in simple white cotton. No longer the jeweled monarch of Versailles' golden halls. The bloodthirsty crowd roars thunderous approval as Citizen Capet, as revolutionary tribunals now call her, kneels before the gleaming blade that has claimed so many noble necks. Executioner Sanson holds her severed head high toward the gray October sky, and Paris erupts in wild celebration. The gentle thud of the falling blade, the sudden deadly silence, then thunderous cheers rolling like ocean waves across ancient cobblestones. Did the Queen's dramatic death truly satisfy the people's burning hunger for justice, or merely feed their insatiable taste for royal spectacle? You're standing in the bitter, crisp January air of 1649 London, where delicate snowflakes drift silently onto a wooden scaffold that would forever change how subjects viewed their supposedly divinely appointed kings and royal authority. Charles Stuart steps regally through the banqueting house's tall windows onto the specially constructed platform, his breath visible in the freezing air. Thousands pack Whitehall's narrow streets, despite the bone-chilling cold, watching their anointed monarch, who claimed God himself personally chose kings through divine providence. Prepare to meet the hooded headsman's gleaming steel axe. He deliberately wears two warm shirts to prevent nervous shivering that hostile crowds might cruelly mistake for cowardly fear. The silent masked executioner waits patiently as Charles speaks his carefully prepared final words about divine authority and earthly justice. One swift, decisive stroke echoes through the square, and centuries of absolute monarchy crumble like ancient parchment. When defiant subjects execute their sacred king, do they kill the mortal man or the very idea of divine rulership itself? You're stepping into the oppressive, sweltering heat of July 1794 Paris, where the cold architect of the terror finally faces his own murderous creation before crowds drunk on years of revolutionary bloodlust and political vengeance. Maximilien Robespierre, the self-proclaimed incorruptible who methodically sent thousands of innocent souls to the guillotine in virtue's holy name, now painfully climbs those same blood-stained wooden steps, with his jaw completely shattered by a desperate pistol shot. The man who endlessly preached revolutionary purity and moral virtue cannot even speak his carefully prepared final words through his mangled mouth. Place de la Révolution fills completely with excited citizens who once enthusiastically cheered his passionate speeches about virtue and necessary terror. The bitter irony tastes sharp as sweltering Parisian summer air. The fanatical leader who proclaimed only death could preserve precious liberty now provides the ultimate bloody proof of his twisted philosophy. Does the executioner's claimed virtue die completely with him, or does it live on eternally in the very act of his execution? You're walking slowly across Tower Green's dewy grass on a misty May morning in 1536, where England's most controversial and ambitious queen would meet her carefully orchestrated death by a specially imported French sword rather than the traditional English axe. Henry VIII's tempestuous second wife, proud mother of the future Elizabeth I, kneels gracefully on the scaffold, wearing an elegant gray damask gown and pristine white ermine mantle that catches the pale morning light. Her alleged crime? Catastrophically failing to produce the desperately needed male heir, and supposedly committing adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George. The unusually quiet crowd remains respectfully silent. Many still vividly remember her magnificent coronation pageantry just 3 short years earlier. An expert French swordsman, specially summoned from distant Calais for his renowned skill, waits patiently with his razor-sharp blade gleaming in the dawn light. Anne carefully removes her jeweled headdress, gently binds her dark eyes with silk, and whispers final prayers in both English and French. When queens die purely for kings' political convenience, who truly holds the crown's ultimate power? You're breathing the thick, acrid smoke hanging heavily over Rouen bustling marketplace on May 30th, 1431, where France's future patron saint dies as a condemned heretic before jeering English and Burgundian crowds seeking brutal vengeance. Hey friends, if you're enjoying these fascinating glimpses into history's darkest and most dramatic spectacles, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that shaped our world. 19-year-old Jeanne d'Arc, the completely illiterate farmer's daughter who miraculously crowned a weak king and heroically drove back seasoned English armies, now stands firmly chained to a tall wooden stake surrounded by bundled kindling. Her supposed crimes include brazenly wearing men's military clothing, boldly claiming direct divine revelation from heavenly saints, and stubbornly refusing to submit to established church authority. The nervous crowd watches anxiously as hungry orange flames lick higher around her simple peasant dress. Some cross themselves fearfully, others jeer mockingly. English soldiers deliberately pile green wood to prolong her agonizing suffering, but the brave girl who claimed to hear Archangel Michael's voice maintains her unwavering faith. When future saints burn as present heretics, does the consuming fire destroy truth or merely inconvenient prophecy? You're sitting quietly in a dim Athens prison cell in 399 BC, where democracy's most famous victim calmly discusses the soul's immortality while peacefully preparing to drink the state-sanctioned poison that will end his life. The wise 70-year-old philosopher, unjustly condemned for supposedly corrupting impressionable youth and disrespecting the city's ancient gods, firmly refuses his devoted friend's desperate escape plans, and instead conducts his final philosophical seminar on death's mysterious nature. Athenian law generously offers comfortable exile as an alternative punishment, but principled Socrates deliberately chooses bitter hemlock, logically arguing that fleeing would essentially admit guilt to false charges. His weeping students gather closely as he calmly bathes, jokes cheerfully about owing a rooster to healing god Asclepius, then drinks the bitter cup without trembling hands. The deadly poison slowly numbs his legs, then gradually his torso, while he continues teaching about the soul's eternal journey beyond mere bodily death. Can a supposedly wise society that kills its wisest voices truly claim to love wisdom and truth? You're standing solemnly on Tower Hill's wooden scaffold in sweltering July 1535, where England's most principled statesman courageously chooses certain death rather than acknowledge his king's claimed supremacy over ancient Rome and papal authority. Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII's brilliant former Lord Chancellor and celebrated author of the influential Utopia, now faces the sharp executioner's block for steadfastly refusing to swear the politically required oath of supremacy. The uncertain crowd murmurs anxiously. Many genuinely respected this lawyer saint who joked constantly even while imprisoned in the tower's dark cells. More humbly asks for prayers for the king, as a good servant, but God's first, then professionally examines the axe blade's sharpness, commenting knowledgeably on its fine edge. He carefully repositions his gray beard to avoid the fatal stroke, quipping wittily that it committed no treason against the crown. One powerful blow severs the head of the man who absolutely would not bend sacred conscience to royal convenience. When personal integrity costs absolutely everything, Does the principled martyr lose or gain the ultimate victory? You're standing apprehensively in Rome's busy Campo dei Fiori on February 17, 1600, where the merciless Inquisition burns alive a brilliant monk whose revolutionary scientific vision threatened the very foundations of established cosmic order. Brother Bruno, the radical Dominican philosopher who dared publicly suggest infinite worlds and constantly moving planets, faces the terrible stake after 8 long years of imprisonment and systematic torture in the Inquisition's dark dungeons. His dangerous crime? Teaching forbidden Copernican astronomy, boldly denying Christ's divine nature, and proposing that distant stars were actually suns with their own orbiting planets. The nervous crowd watches fearfully as black-robed executioners tie him securely to the wooden post. Bruno's tongue has been cruelly pierced with an iron spike to prevent final blasphemous words. High-ranking cardinals observe silently from nearby palace windows as hungry flames gradually consume the visionary man who imagined countless universes beyond human counting. When scientific visionaries burn for seeing too far beyond accepted truth, do flames consume knowledge or illuminate it for future generations? You're breathing the bitter acrid smoke drifting over Constance's crowded marketplace on July 6th, 1415, where a courageous Bohemian priest's agonizing death would ignite a full century of devastating religious warfare across Central Europe. Master Jan Hus, respected rector of prestigious Prague University and devoted disciple of English reformer John Wycliffe, stands firmly chained to the wooden stake despite explicit promises of safe conduct from Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund himself. His alleged crime? Preaching passionately in common Czech language, demanding urgent church reform, and claiming papal authority isn't absolutely divine. The mixed crowd includes curious nobles, suspicious clergy, and common people from across the vast empire. Brave Hus refuses all final recantation offers, declaring solemnly he cannot abandon fundamental truths he taught. As orange flames rise steadily around his academic robes, he sings hymns clearly in his beloved native tongue. His burning triggers the devastating Hussite Wars, Czech nationalism, and Protestant Reformation a full century before Luther's birth. When religious reformers die for speaking divine truth in common tongues, does fire silence or amplify their message? You're walking carefully through Alexandria's dusty, narrow streets in violent March 415 AD, where dangerous religious fanaticism brutally destroys the ancient world's greatest female mathematician and renowned astronomer in broad daylight. Hypatia, brilliant daughter of mathematician Theon and distinguished head of Alexandria's prestigious Neoplatonic school, becomes tragically trapped in the bitter political conflict between Patriarch Cyril and Prefect Orestes. Fanatical Christian monks, led by the zealot Peter the Reader, violently drag the 50-year-old philosopher from her chariot during the holy season of Lent. Inside the Caesareum church, they strip her completely naked and scrape her tender flesh with sharp oyster shells until she dies in agony. Her dismembered body burns outside the city walls while crowds cheer. The zealous mob celebrates destroying the wise woman who taught forbidden pagan philosophy, advanced astronomy, and complex mathematics to both Christian and pagan students alike. When religious mobs kill wisdom in their God's name, do they truly serve divinity or destroy it completely? You're standing in the cold January air of 1793 Paris, where a monarch's final transformation from divine ruler to mortal man unfolds before tens of thousands of witnesses crammed into Place de la Révolution. King Louis XVI, the indecisive ruler who never wanted the throne, climbs the scaffold steps with surprising dignity after months of imprisonment and trial. The crowd falls unusually silent as the man who once claimed divine right now appears simply human. No crown, no ermine, just a plain brown coat and white waistcoat. He attempts to address the people, declaring his forgiveness for those who condemned him. But drummers drown out his words on orders from officials who fear his final speech might inspire sympathy. The guillotine blade falls with a dull thud, and the crowd erupts in celebration while some dip handkerchiefs in royal blood. His death marks the absolute end of France's ancient monarchy and the birth of a republic built on revolutionary ideals. When kings become men in their final moments, do they find the humanity their crown once obscured? You're walking along the Appian Way in 71 BC, where 6,000 crucified rebels stretch for miles like a forest of suffering, marking Rome's brutal answer to slave uprising and dreams of freedom. The Thracian gladiator who led history's greatest slave revolt now hangs among his followers on wooden crosses lining the road from Capua to Rome. Spartacus had transformed kitchen slaves, field workers, and arena fighters into an army that terrified the Republic for 2 years, defeating Roman legions and offering hope to millions in bondage. Marcus Crassus, the wealthy general who finally crushed the rebellion, orders this massive display of crucified bodies as a warning to any slave dreaming of freedom. The crosses stand for months, visible to every traveler entering Rome, their occupants slowly dying under the Mediterranean sun. Roman citizens hurry past without looking up, while slaves walking in chains pause to whisper prayers for the man who showed them they could fight. When freedom fighters become symbols of terror, does their sacrifice inspire or warn future generations? You're breathing the thick smoke rising over Florence's Piazza della Signoria on May 23, 1498. Where the Dominican monk who burned vanities now burns himself before the very citizens who once followed his sermons. Brother Savonarola, the fiery preacher who convinced Florentines to destroy their art, books, and cosmetics in great bonfires of the vanities, faces his own pyre after Pope Alexander VI excommunicated him for political defiance. The crowd includes many who once threw their mirrors and paintings into his fires, now watching their former prophet stripped of his robes and chained to the stake. He had ruled Florence like a theocrat, banning gambling, rich clothing, and secular music while preaching that God would purify the city through suffering. Executioners light the kindling as church bells toll across the city. His ashes scatter over the same square where citizens once gathered to hear him promise divine reformation through earthly destruction. When prophets of purification face the flames themselves, do they find the divine justice they preached to others? You're standing in London's Smithfield on June 15, 1381, where a humble blacksmith's confrontation with teenage King Richard II ends in bloodshed that shapes England's relationship between rulers and subjects. Wat Tyler, leader of the Great Peasants' Revolt, rides confidently into Smithfield, believing he can negotiate directly with the 14-year-old king about reducing crushing taxes and ending serfdom. Tens of thousands of rebels camp outside London's walls while their champion meets the royal party in person. The meeting turns violent when Mayor William Walworth stabs Tyler during heated negotiations about peasant freedoms. The wounded rebel leader falls from his horse as royal soldiers surround him, and the king's men finish him with their swords. His head soon decorates London Bridge alongside other rebel leaders. The revolt collapses without its charismatic leader, but his bold demand for peasant rights echoes through English history, inspiring future uprisings against noble oppression. When common folk dare speak as equals to kings, does their courage die with them or live on in future voices? You're standing in Melbourne's old jail on November 11, 1880, where Australia's most famous outlaw faces the gallows wearing leg irons instead of his legendary iron suit that made him a colonial legend. Edward Ned Kelly, the Irish-Australian bushranger who robbed banks and fought police in a homemade suit of armor, now waits calmly in his cell before the morning execution. His gang had terrorized Victoria's countryside for years, stealing from the wealthy and giving to poor Irish families while evading capture in the rugged bush. At his final siege in Glenrowan, Kelly emerged from his crude iron armor like a medieval knight, firing at police until bullets found the gaps in his metal suit. The crowd outside Melbourne jail includes many Irish settlers who see him as a folk hero fighting English colonial oppression. His famous last words, "Such is life," become Australia's most quoted phrase, transforming a convicted murderer into a symbol of defiant independence. When outlaws become legends in their own lifetime, do they die as criminals or as martyrs for their people? You're standing outside Charleston's old jail on February 18, 1820, where the innkeeper who murdered guests faces the gallows while maintaining her innocence and cursing the city that condemned her. Lavinia Fisher, the beautiful proprietor of the 6-Mile Wayfarer house, climbs the scaffold wearing her white wedding dress, claiming she wants to die in the outfit that made her happiest. She and her husband John had allegedly drugged and robbed travelers at their isolated inn outside Charleston, feeding victims poisoned tea before stealing their belongings and disposing of bodies. The crowd includes many men who had visited her inn and lived to tell tales of her unsettling beauty and strange hospitality. She addresses the gathered citizens with defiant words. "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, I'll carry it." Local newspapers sensationalize her story, creating America's first famous female criminal celebrity and inspiring countless legends about deadly innkeepers. When beautiful women turn deadly, does society fear their crimes or their power to deceive men's hearts? You're watching from Westminster's Old Palace Yard on January 31st, 1606, where the Catholic conspirator who tried to blow up Parliament faces the gruesome traitor's death before crowds hungry for justice. Guido Fawkes, the Yorkshire-born soldier discovered with 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords, climbs the gallows after months of torture in the Tower of London. His plot to kill King James I and restore Catholic rule had terrified Protestant England, sparking nationwide celebrations when authorities caught him on November 5th. The crowd roars approval as executioners prepare the traditional hanging, drawing, and quartering reserved for traitors. Fawkes, weakened by torture, jumps from the ladder before hanging could properly begin, breaking his neck to avoid the worse fate of being cut down alive for disembowelment. His death becomes an annual celebration throughout England, with children burning his effigy while chanting, "Remember, remember the 5th of November." When religious fanatics try to change history with violence, do they become devils or martyrs in popular memory? You're standing in Cairo's Citadel courtyard on August 15, 1952, where Egyptian authorities execute communist organizers for attempting to establish Soviet-style revolution during the nationalist uprising that overthrows King Farouk. Henri Curiel, Shudi Attia, and other communist intellectuals face hanging after military tribunals condemn their attempts to transform Egyptian independence movement into Marxist revolution that threatened both British interests and Egyptian national character. The crowd includes both nationalist supporters, celebrating elimination of foreign ideology, and working-class sympathizers who see the condemned as heroes fighting for social justice against both imperial domination and domestic exploitation. The executions occur during the crucial transition period when nationalist officers seize power while eliminating competing revolutionary movements that might challenge their authority or complicate negotiations with Western powers. The deaths of communist organizers demonstrate how successful revolutions often execute rival revolutionaries to maintain unity while proving that nationalist movements can be as deadly to leftist allies as to imperial enemies. When nationalist revolutionaries execute communist allies after achieving power, do they preserve their revolution's purity or reveal revolution's tendency to devour its own children? You're standing in London's Smithfield on August 23rd, 1305, where Scotland's greatest hero faces the traitor's death that will make him immortal in his people's memory and inspire centuries of independence movements. Sir William Wallace, the guardian of Scotland who defeated English armies at Stirling Bridge, now endures the full horror of medieval execution for high treason against King Edward I. The crowd includes many Scots forced to witness their champion's destruction as a warning against further rebellion. Wallace refuses to beg for mercy, declaring he cannot be a traitor to a king he never served, since Scotland remains a free nation under God. Executioners carry out the full sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering with deliberate slowness, displaying his severed head on London Bridge while sending quarters of his body to 4 Scottish cities as grisly warnings. His brutal death only strengthens Scottish resolve for independence, transforming a fallen guardian into an eternal symbol of national freedom that inspires rebels across centuries. When heroes die horribly for their people's freedom, does their suffering end their cause or make it immortal? You're standing outside Sing Sing prison on June 19, 1953, where a husband and wife face the electric chair as the first American civilians executed for espionage, dividing the nation over justice and Cold War fears. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the Communist Party members convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, walk to separate electric chairs while thousands protest their innocence outside the prison walls. Their case had polarized America during the height of McCarthyism, with supporters claiming they were scapegoats for Cold War hysteria, while others demanded death for atomic treason. The couple maintained their innocence through 2 years of appeals, refusing to confess in exchange for commuted sentences while their young sons waited at home. Ethel requires a second jolt of electricity to complete her execution, shocking witnesses in the death chamber. Their deaths transformed them into martyrs for the political left, while conservatives celebrate justice for atomic espionage, creating a lasting symbol of Cold War paranoia and divided American justice. When couples die together for political crimes, do they achieve the unity in death they sought in life? You're standing on Cerro de las Campanas Hill outside Querétaro on June 19, 1867, where Napoleon III's puppet emperor faces Mexican rifles that will reshape Latin American independence and European colonial ambitions. Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria, the well-meaning nobleman who accepted the Mexican crown from French bayonets, stands before a firing squad alongside his loyal generals Miramon and Mejia. The liberal forces of Benito Juarez had captured the reluctant emperor after French troops withdrew, leaving him defenseless against Republican forces. Maximilian wears a simple black suit instead of imperial regalia, having distributed his remaining gold coins to his executioners as a final act of nobility. The firing squad hesitates. Many admire this foreign prince who genuinely tried to modernize Mexico despite his illegitimate rule. 3 volleys echo across the dusty hills as the last European emperor in the Americas falls. His death signals the end of Old World interference in the New World, inspiring Republican movements across Latin America while shocking European monarchies. When well-intentioned princes play emperor in foreign lands, do they die as invaders or as tragic idealists? You're standing in Florence's Piazza della Signoria on April 28, 1478, where the Medici family stages public executions of conspirators who attempted to assassinate Lorenzo the Magnificent during Easter Mass, transforming failed political murder into spectacular state justice. Francesco Pazzi, Archbishop Francesco Salviati, and dozens of other conspirators hang from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, while crowds witness the Medici response to the banking family's attempt to seize control of Florence through coordinated assassination. The executions occur within hours of the failed plot, with some conspirators hanged in their ecclesiastical robes to demonstrate that not even church rank protects against treason. Lorenzo himself supervises the hangings from his palace balcony, his bandaged wounds visible to spectators who recognize their ruler's survival as divine providence protecting Florence from foreign manipulation. The swift public justice eliminates immediate threats while establishing Medici authority through spectacular display of power that transforms victims into victors through theatrical revenge. When banking families execute their rivals from palace windows, do they demonstrate justice or reveal how commerce becomes warfare through public spectacle? You're standing outside Charlestown Jail on December 2nd, 1859, where the radical abolitionist who tried to spark a slave rebellion faces the gallows while the nation teeters on the edge of civil war. Captain John Brown, the fierce anti-slavery warrior who led the bloody raid on Harper's Ferry Arsenal, climbs the scaffold with serene dignity, while thousands of Virginia militiamen guard against rescue attempts by Northern sympathizers. His failed attempt to arm enslaved people and trigger a massive uprising had terrified the South and electrified the North, pushing America closer to the conflict he believed inevitable. Brown hands his jailer a prophetic note predicting that only blood could wash away the sin of slavery. The crowd includes many enslaved people forced to witness the execution as a warning, while Northern newspapers prepare to transform the old man into an anti-slavery martyr. His death galvanizes abolitionists and convinces Southerners that the North seeks their destruction, making civil war almost certain within 2 years. When radical prophets die for their cause, do their gallows become altars that sanctify their violent methods? You're standing in Seville's Plaza de San Francisco on February 6, 1481, where the Spanish Inquisition conducts its first auto da fe, publicly burning 6 conversos for secretly practicing Judaism despite their Christian conversion. The condemned conversos, including wealthy merchants and respected community leaders, face the flames while wearing pointed caps and yellow sanbenitos that mark them as relapsed heretics who threatened Christian Spain's religious purity through hidden Jewish practices. Thousands of spectators witnessed this inaugural ceremony of the Spanish Inquisition, designed to demonstrate royal determination to achieve religious unity through elimination of crypto-Jews who might contaminate Christian society. The burning occurs after elaborate processions and sermons that transform execution into religious theater, with the condemned given final opportunities to repent before facing purifying flames. These first auto da fe establish patterns for centuries of Inquisition spectacles that eliminate religious diversity while entertaining crowds with the destruction of alleged enemies of Christian faith. When inquisitors burn conversos for hidden faith, do they purify Christian society or create the very contamination they fear through spectacular religious hatred? You're standing in Cusco's main plaza on May 18, 1781, where Spanish colonial authorities staged the most brutal public execution in Andean history to crush indigenous dreams of restored Inca rule forever. José Gabriel Condorcanqui, who claimed descent from the last Inca emperor and took the name Tupac Amaru II, faces horrific death by quartering after his massive rebellion against Spanish rule consumed the Peruvian highlands for months. Colonial authorities force his wife, children, and followers to watch as 4 horses attempt to tear his body apart, but his strong frame resists, requiring executioners to hack him to pieces instead. Thousands of indigenous people pack the plaza, many weeping openly as their liberator dies, while Spanish colonists celebrate the end of the greatest threat to their rule. His severed head will tour rebel villages as a warning, but his sacrifice transforms him into an eternal symbol of indigenous resistance. The Spanish believe they've executed a rebellion, but they've actually created a martyrdom that inspires liberation movements for centuries. When ancient bloodlines challenge colonial power, does their royal death restore their crown or shatter their kingdom? You're standing in Place de la Revolution on November 3, 1793, where the woman who demanded rights for her sex faces the same blade that claimed Marie Antoinette, proving that revolutionary justice knows no gender. Marie Gouze, known as Olympe de Gouges, climbs the scaffold after writing the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, challenging the revolution's male leaders to extend equality to all citizens regardless of sex. The playwright and political activist had dared suggest that women deserved the same rights as men, including the vote, property ownership, and political participation. Revolutionary tribunals condemn her for defending the deposed queen and criticizing Robespierre's violent methods, but her real crime was demanding true equality in a revolution led by men. The crowd watches nervously as the blade falls. Many women recognize that challenging male authority, even in the name of liberty, can prove fatal. Her death silences the revolution's most articulate feminist voice while proving that even movements for freedom can execute those who demand too much liberation. When revolutionaries for equality silence voices demanding true equality, do they betray their cause or reveal its limits? You're standing against Père Lachaise cemetery wall on May 28, 1871. Where government troops execute communard musicians and composers who created revolutionary anthems that inspired Paris workers during the world's first socialist revolution. Jean-Baptiste Clément, composer of Le Temps des Cerises, and dozens of other musical revolutionaries face firing squads as French government forces systematically eliminate cultural figures who gave voice to working-class rebellion through songs that became battle hymns of social revolution. The musicians die singing their own compositions, transforming their execution into final performance, while government forces recognize that revolutionary music poses as much threat to established order as armed resistance. Their deaths climax Bloody Week, during which conservative forces kill thousands of communards while specifically targeting artists, writers, and musicians who created the cultural foundation for socialist politics. The execution of revolutionary composers silences their voices while ensuring their songs become eternal symbols of working-class struggle that inspire international socialist movements for generations. When governments execute musicians for revolutionary songs, do they silence dangerous melodies or make them immortal through martyrs' blood? You're standing in Kilifi Village Square in German East Africa on March 3, 1906, where colonial authorities execute Kinjeketile Ngwale and other leaders who convinced thousands of Africans that sacred water would make them bulletproof against European weapons. The prophet Kinjeketile and his fellow resistance leaders faced German gallows after their spiritual movement inspired the largest anti-colonial uprising in East African history, uniting dozens of tribes through shared belief in magical protection against imperial military technology. The crowd includes both German colonists celebrating elimination of dangerous religious fanatics and African villagers mourning spiritual leaders who promised liberation from forced labor and cultural destruction through divine intervention. The hangings eliminate organized resistance while demonstrating German determination to destroy indigenous religious authority that challenged colonial control through supernatural means. The executed prophets become martyrs, whose sacrifice proves that spiritual resistance can threaten imperial power even when military rebellion fails through technological disadvantage. When colonial powers execute religious prophets for promising magical protection against modern weapons, do they eliminate dangerous superstition or create eternal symbols of spiritual resistance? You're standing in Budapest's Kossuth Square on June 16, 1958, where Imre Nagy and other leaders of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution face secret execution by Soviet authorities for demanding democratic socialism and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. Prime Minister Nagy, Defense Minister Paul Maleter, and journalist Miklos Gimes die by hanging in Budapest prison after show trials that demonstrate Soviet determination to crush any attempts at independent socialism within their sphere of influence. The executions occur in secret, with Hungarian citizens unaware their revolutionary heroes have died until years later, while Soviet authorities claim the leaders were dangerous counter-revolutionaries who threatened socialist unity through democratic deviation. The deaths eliminate Hungarian hopes for reform while creating martyrs whose sacrifice inspires future resistance movements throughout Eastern Europe that eventually achieve the freedom they died seeking. Their secret executions prove that even communist governments will kill their own allies when independence threatens imperial control over satellite nations and ideological conformity. When communist superpowers secretly execute democratic socialist allies, do they preserve revolutionary unity or create the martyrs who eventually destroy their empire through moral authority? You're standing in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587, where Elizabeth I's greatest rival faces the axe after 18 years of captivity, setting England on a collision course with Catholic Europe and Spanish vengeance. Mary Stuart, the Scottish queen who claimed the English throne through her Tudor bloodline, kneels at the block wearing a crimson petticoat, the Catholic color of martyrdom, while her small dog hides beneath her skirts, refusing to leave his mistress even in death. The crowd includes Protestant nobles who demanded her execution, and Catholics who see her as a martyr for their faith. Elizabeth I had reluctantly signed the death warrant after years of plots to place Mary on the English throne, but the Queen's execution will trigger the Spanish Armada and unite Catholic Europe against Protestant England. The executioner requires 3 strokes to sever her head, and when he lifts it to show the crowd, her auburn wig falls away to reveal gray hair, shocking witnesses with this reminder of her mortality. Her death transforms her from political threat to religious martyr. When rival queens execute each other's claims to divine rule, do they settle the succession or create eternal war? You're standing outside Charlestown State Prison on August 23, 1927, where 2 Italian immigrants face the electric chair in a case that exposes the dark intersection of prejudice, politics, and justice in Roaring Twenties America. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, the shoemaker and fish peddler convicted of armed robbery and murder, despite questionable evidence, walk to their deaths while protesters worldwide demand their freedom. Their 7-year legal battle had become a symbol of American xenophobia and class warfare, dividing the nation between those who saw them as dangerous anarchists and those who believed them framed for their radical politics and Italian heritage. The prison fills with witnesses while thousands gather outside, some praying for justice, others celebrating the execution of alleged cop killers. Vanzetti's final words proclaim their innocence and forgive their executioners, transforming 2 obscure immigrants into international martyrs for social justice. Their deaths inspired decades of protest literature, folk songs, and political movements challenging American inequality. When justice becomes theater and immigrants become symbols, do the executed die for their crimes or their otherness? You're standing on a dusty Louisiana road on May 23, 1934, where the most famous criminal couple in American history meets their end not on a scaffold, but in a hail of police bullets that transforms bank robbers into folk heroes. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the Depression-era outlaws who robbed banks across the Southwest while capturing America's imagination through newspaper photographs and romantic ballads, die together in their stolen Ford as lawmen fire over 100 rounds into their car. The young couple had become symbols of rebellion against a system that seemed to offer only poverty and despair to working-class Americans during the economic collapse. Local crowds gather around their bullet-riddled bodies, souvenir hunters cutting pieces from Bonnie's dress and Clyde's shirt while photographers document the grisly scene. Their dramatic deaths at ages 23 and 25 ensure their transformation from small-time criminals into legendary figures representing freedom, romance, and defiance against authority during America's darkest economic hour. When outlaws die young and violently, do they become martyrs for desperate times or warnings against lawless dreams? You're standing in Spanish Town, Jamaica, on March 15, 1796, where British colonial authorities execute Maroon War leader Cudjoe Fraser for leading the Second Maroon War against plantation slavery, despite previous peace treaties guaranteeing freedom. Captain Cudjoe and his fellow Maroon commanders face hanging after British forces crush their rebellion using bloodhounds imported from Cuba to hunt escaped slaves through Jamaica's mountain forests, where free black communities had existed for over a century. The crowd includes both plantation owners celebrating the elimination of dangerous rebel leaders and enslaved people forced to witness the price of resistance against the institution that defined colonial society. The executions violate previous treaties that recognized Maroon independence in exchange for hunting other escaped slaves, demonstrating how colonial authorities break agreements when convenient while using spectacular punishment to terrorize potential rebels. Cudjoe's death eliminates organized resistance while transforming him into a martyr for black freedom, whose sacrifice inspires future slave rebellions throughout the Caribbean. When colonial powers execute treaty partners for defending their promised freedom, do they demonstrate legal authority or reveal that imperial law means nothing when challenged? You're standing in the pre-dawn darkness of Vincennes Fortress on October 15, 1917, where the world's most famous exotic dancer faces a French firing squad for espionage charges that remain questionable a century later. Margaretha Gertrude Azel, the Dutch woman who reinvented herself as the exotic Mata Hari and danced her way into the beds of European officers during World War I, refuses a blindfold as 12 soldiers raise their rifles in the fortress courtyard. French military authorities needed a scapegoat for their devastating losses on the Western Front, and the foreign-born courtesan who entertained German officers provided the perfect target for wartime paranoia and misogyny. She blows a kiss to her executioners before the volleys ring out, maintaining her theatrical persona even in death while spectators debate whether they've witnessed justice or judicial murder. No credible evidence ever proved she passed military secrets to anyone, but her execution satisfies public demand for someone to blame for French military failures, while transforming a minor entertainer into an eternal symbol of feminine mystery and injustice. When exotic women become scapegoats for military disasters, do they die for their crimes or their gender? You're standing in Westminster's Old Palace Yard on January 30th and 31st, 1606, where 8 Catholic conspirators face the traitor's death for attempting to blow up Parliament and restore Catholic rule to Protestant England. Everard Digby, Robert Wintour, John Grant, and Thomas Bates climb the scaffold on the first day, followed by Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, and Guy Fawkes the next, each enduring the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering reserved for high treason. The crowd includes many Catholics forced to witness the executions as warnings against further plots, while Protestant citizens celebrate the destruction of papist conspirators who nearly murdered their king in Parliament. Each man faces the gruesome ritual differently. Some beg forgiveness, others maintain defiant silence, but all provide spectacular entertainment for Londoners hungry for justice and revenge. Their deaths end Catholic hopes for violent restoration, while establishing November 5th as a permanent celebration of Protestant survival, complete with bonfires, fireworks, and Guy Fawkes effigies that continue for centuries. When religious conspirators die horribly for their failed plots, do their executions prevent future terrorism or inspire it? You're standing outside Committee Prison in Nairobi on January 18, 1957, where British colonial forces publicly execute Kikuyu elders caught administering traditional oaths that bound participants to fight for land and freedom against white settler rule. General China, Waruhiu Itoti, and other Mau Mau commanders face hanging, while colonial authorities force entire communities to witness the execution of men who used traditional Kikuyu rituals to create unity among resistance fighters seeking to reclaim ancestral territories. The crowd includes both British settlers celebrating destruction of savage customs and Kikuyu villagers terrified into silence while secretly honoring their executed elders as guardians of cultural identity against foreign domination. The public executions aim to break traditional authority structures while demonstrating that colonial law supersedes indigenous customs and religious practices that threaten white supremacy. The deaths of oath-givers transform traditional ceremonies into revolutionary acts, while proving that cultural preservation becomes political resistance when practiced under colonial oppression that seeks to destroy indigenous identity. When colonial powers execute traditional leaders for cultural ceremonies, do they eliminate primitive customs or create martyrs for cultural survival against imperial destruction? You're standing peacefully on Delhi's parade ground in September 1857, where British forces execute sepoy mutineers by tying them to cannon mouths and firing, creating spectacular military punishments designed to terrorize the Indian population into renewed submission. Mangal Pandey's fellow rebels who killed British officers and proclaimed restoration of Mughal rule faced the traditional punishment of being blown from guns, as British commanders deliberately choose this method to demonstrate their mastery of Indian customs while revealing their willingness to use extreme violence against subject peoples. The gathered crowds include both British residents celebrating brutal justice against treacherous natives and Indian spectators forced to witness the price of challenging white supremacy through military rebellion against colonial authority that claimed divine sanction. The cannon executions eliminate immediate military resistance while creating martyrs whose spectacular deaths inspire future independence movements that remember these soldiers as the first freedom fighters against foreign domination of their homeland. The deliberate brutality of these executions ensures they become legendary symbols of both British cruelty and Indian courage that inspire decades of resistance literature and nationalist mythology throughout the subcontinent. When imperial powers execute rebels using traditional punishments for maximum psychological impact, do they demonstrate cultural understanding or reveal their capacity for theatrical cruelty against colonized peoples? You're standing on Gallows Hill in Salem, Massachusetts, on June 10, 1692, where the first victim of America's deadliest witch hunt faces the noose while Puritan townspeople watch their community tear itself apart through supernatural accusations and social hysteria. Bridget Bishop, the tavern keeper known for her colorful dress and outspoken manner, climbs the ladder to the hanging tree while maintaining her innocence of practicing witchcraft, becoming the first of 20 people executed during Salem's months of madness. The crowd includes neighbors who once drank at her tavern and former friends who now believe she made a pact with the devil to torment their children and livestock through malevolent magic. Puritan ministers justify her death as necessary to purify their godly community, while spectators search her behavior for signs of supernatural guilt or innocence. Her execution opens the floodgates for more accusations and deaths, transforming a small colonial settlement into a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, religious extremism, and community paranoia that resonates through American culture for centuries. When communities execute their neighbors for invisible crimes, do they destroy evil or create it through their own fear? You're standing in Munich's Stadelheim prison on February 22, 1943, where 3 university students face the guillotine for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets, proving that even totalitarian states fear the power of youthful idealism and moral courage. Sophie Scholl, her brother Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst members of the non-violent White Rose resistance group, walk calmly to their executions just 4 days after their arrest for scattering leaflets calling for German resistance to Hitler's regime throughout the University of Munich. The 21-year-old philosophy student shows no fear as she approaches the guillotine, declaring that their deaths will inspire others to continue the fight against Nazi tyranny. Prison officials allow no public witnesses, but word of their courage spreads throughout Germany as Allied bombers demonstrate the truth of their warnings about inevitable defeat. Their sacrifice transforms 3 obscure students into symbols of moral resistance, whose leaflets, smuggled out of Germany, inspire Allied propaganda and prove that even in the darkest totalitarian night, individual conscience can shine like stars. When students die for distributing forbidden truths, do their executions silence dangerous ideas or make them immortal? You're standing in Palermo's streets on March 30th, 1282, where Sicilian rebels systematically massacre French officials and settlers during the uprising that begins with evening prayers and ends with the elimination of Angevin rule through popular violence. French nobles, tax collectors, and their families face death by sword, club, and stones, as Sicilian crowds respond to decades of exploitation and cultural suppression by eliminating every French presence from their island through coordinated popular uprising. The massacres begin during Vespers at the Church of the Holy Spirit, when a French soldier's inappropriate behavior toward a Sicilian woman triggers citywide rebellion that spreads throughout the island within hours. The killings target anyone who speaks French or supports Angevin rule, transforming religious service into revolutionary signal while demonstrating how cultural oppression can explode into ethnic cleansing when popular patience reaches its breaking point. The Sicilian Vespers eliminate French control while establishing patterns of southern Italian resistance to foreign domination that influence politics for centuries through memory of successful popular rebellion. When evening prayers become signals for ethnic massacre, do the rebels achieve liberation, or reveal how oppression creates the very violence it claims to prevent through cultural domination? You're standing at London's execution dock on May 23, 1701, where the tide laps against Wapping's muddy shore as Captain William Kidd faces the gallows for piracy, transforming from respected sea captain to legendary buccaneer in the public imagination. William Kidd, the Scottish sailor commissioned by the English government to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean, now swings from the gibbet after political winds shifted and his former patrons abandoned him to save their own reputations. The crowd includes merchants, sailors, and curious Londoners who came to witness the death of the man newspapers portrayed as the most notorious pirate of his age. Kidd maintains his innocence, claiming he only attacked enemy French ships as his commission allowed. But powerful men needed a scapegoat for their failed colonial schemes. The rope breaks during his first hanging attempt, requiring a second noose to complete the execution, while spectators debate whether this represents divine intervention or mechanical failure. His tarred body hangs in chains for years as a warning to other sailors, while treasure hunters search endlessly for his legendary buried gold. When honest sailors become convenient pirates in political theater, do they die for their crimes or their inconvenience? You're standing in St. Petersburg's Peter and Paul Fortress on July 13, 1826, where 5 aristocratic officers face the gallows for attempting to overthrow Tsar Nicholas I and establish constitutional monarchy in autocratic Russia. Pavel Pestel, Kondraty Ryliev, Sergei Muravyov-Apostol, Mikhail Bestuzhev-Ryumin, and Pyotr Kakhovsky, the leaders of the December 14th uprising, climbed the scaffold as the first Russian nobles executed for political crimes in decades, shocking a society that believed aristocratic blood protected against capital punishment. These officers had absorbed liberal ideas while fighting Napoleon across Europe, returning home determined to free their serfs and limit imperial power through constitutional government. The crowd includes many sympathizers who share their beliefs but lack their courage, watching nervously as the Tsar demonstrates his absolute authority over even the highest-born subjects. Their deaths silence immediate hopes for reform, while inspiring future generations of Russian revolutionaries who remember these martyrs as the first to die for political freedom. Their sacrifice transforms aristocratic rebellion into a sacred cause that echoes through Russian history. When nobles die for challenging divine right, do they betray their class or elevate it to new moral heights? You're standing in Place de la Révolution on December 8, 1793, where Louis XV's former mistress faces the guillotine, proving that revolutionary justice spares no one who lived in luxury while the people starved. Jeanne Bécu, Comtesse du Barry, the courtesan who rose from poverty to become the most powerful woman at Versailles, screams and struggles as executioners drag her to the scaffold, her terror contrasting sharply with the dignified deaths of previous royal victims. The crowd roars approval as the woman who once wore diamonds worth kingdoms now wears simple white cotton, her beauty faded by months in prison awaiting trial for corresponding with émigrés and enemies of the Republic. Unlike Marie Antoinette's stoic acceptance, du Barry's raw fear humanizes the victims of revolutionary justice while satisfying popular hatred for aristocratic excess. Her dramatic final moments, begging for mercy and proclaiming her youth, create some of the revolution's most vivid execution scenes while demonstrating that neither royal blood nor common birth provides protection from the blade's equality. When former beauties face death's democracy, do their tears wash away their sins or highlight revolutionary cruelty? You're standing outside the walls of Samarkand in 1501, where the young Timurid prince orders the construction of towers made from enemy skulls, reviving his great-great-grandfather Tamerlane's tradition of terror as political theater. Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, the future founder of the Mughal Empire, commands his soldiers to decapitate thousands of captured rebels and stack their heads into grisly pyramids outside the city gates as a warning to any who might challenge his rule over Central Asia. Local populations gather fearfully to witness these monuments to royal power, while merchants spread tales of the young prince's ruthlessness across the Silk Road trade routes. The skull towers bleach white under the desert sun, creating landmarks visible for miles that advertise Babur's return to his ancestral throne through blood and terror. His revival of Timurid execution spectacles establishes his legitimacy while preparing him for future conquests in Afghanistan and India. When young princes build monuments from enemy skulls, do they construct kingdoms or graveyards for their own souls? You're standing in Münster's marketplace on January 22, 1536, where three leaders of history's most radical Christian experiment face execution by red-hot tongs, ending their attempt to create God's kingdom on earth through revolution and polygamy. Jan van Leyden, Bernd Krechting, and Bernd Knipperdolling, the self-proclaimed kings and prophets who transformed the German city into a communist theocracy, endure prolonged torture before crowds of Catholics and Protestants who united to destroy their Anabaptist New Jerusalem. For 16 months, these radical reformers had banned private property, enforced adult baptism, practiced polygamy, and prepared for Christ's imminent return while besieged armies surrounded their holy city. The crowd watches with horrified fascination as executioners use glowing pincers to tear flesh from the heretics who claimed direct revelation from God and attempted to establish heaven through earthly violence. Their bodies hang in iron cages from St. Lambert's church tower for decades, warning future fanatics about the price of religious extremism while inspiring both persecution and martyrdom narratives that split European Christianity. When religious revolutionaries die for building paradise through terror, do they prove heaven's impossibility or earth's corruption? You're standing on HMS Monarch's deck on March 14, 1757, where a British admiral faces his own Marines' muskets for failing to relieve a besieged garrison. becoming history's most famous victim of military scapegoating. John Byng, the career naval officer court-martialed for not doing his utmost to prevent Minorca's fall to French forces, kneels on his quarterdeck while his own sailors prepare to execute him under the harsh discipline of maritime law. The crowd of officers and seamen watches uncomfortably as their service condemns a man more for political necessity than military failure, since the government needs someone to blame for Mediterranean defeats. Byng faces death with dignity, declaring his innocence while acknowledging his duty to accept the service's judgment, even as many spectators believe he dies for ministerial incompetence rather than naval cowardice. His execution shocks European opinion and inspires Voltaire's famous observation that the English shoot admirals to encourage the others, transforming Byng into a symbol of institutional injustice and the cruel mathematics of military discipline. When professional soldiers execute their commanders for political failures, do they preserve discipline or destroy honor? You're standing in Athens' Agora in 514 BC, where the tyrant Hippias publicly executes Harmodius and Aristogeiton after their failed assassination attempt against his brother Hipparchus, creates the first martyrs for democratic government. The two young aristocrats who struck down Hipparchus during the Panathenaic festival face torture and execution while maintaining they acted to restore Athenian freedom from tyrannical rule that threatened traditional aristocratic privileges and popular assemblies. The crowd includes both supporters of tyranny who celebrate justice against dangerous conspirators and secret Democrats who see the executed pair as heroes fighting for political freedom against arbitrary rule. Their deaths eliminate immediate threats while creating legendary figures whose sacrifice inspires the eventual overthrow of tyranny and establishment of Athenian democracy. The execution transforms failed assassins into founding fathers of democratic government whose memory becomes sacred to future generations fighting against autocratic rule. When tyrants execute aristocratic conspirators for attempting assassination, do they eliminate dangerous enemies or create the martyrs who inspire democratic revolution? You're standing outside Newgate Prison on May 1st, 1820, where 5 working-class radicals face the last public beheadings in English history for plotting to assassinate the entire British cabinet and spark a Republican revolution. Arthur Thistlewood, Richard Tidd, William Davidson, James Ings, and John Thomas Brunt climbed the scaffold for their scheme to murder Lord Liverpool's government during a cabinet dinner and establish a provisional government based on radical democratic principles. The crowd includes many working-class sympathizers who share their anger about economic hardship and political oppression in post-Napoleonic Britain, watching nervously as the state demonstrates its power to crush revolutionary dreams. The executioner follows ancient tradition, holding each severed head high and proclaiming, "Behold the head of a traitor," while spectators debate whether they witness justice or tyranny. Their deaths mark the end of capital punishment for political crimes in Britain, while inspiring Chartist movements and working-class organizing that eventually achieves many of their democratic goals through peaceful means rather than violent revolution. When working-class revolutionaries lose their heads for dreaming of equality, do they die as criminals or prophets? You're standing in Tenochtitlan's Great Plaza in 1520, where the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II dies under mysterious circumstances that both Spanish conquistadors and indigenous chroniclers describe differently, creating one of history's most disputed execution narratives. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the 9th Aztec ruler held captive by Hernán Cortés for months, appears before his angry subjects who demand resistance against Spanish occupation, only to collapse and die from wounds that Spanish sources blame on stones thrown by his own people, while Aztec accounts suggest Spanish murder. The crowd of indigenous warriors and civilians watches their god-emperor's final moments with confusion and rage, seeing either the death of divine authority or its deliberate destruction by foreign invaders seeking to legitimize their conquest. Cortés stages the scene to demonstrate Aztec rejection of their traditional ruler, while indigenous sources preserve alternative narratives of Spanish treachery and imperial martyrdom. The contested nature of Montezuma's death reflects the collision of two civilizations and their incompatible concepts of legitimate authority, creating competing martyrdom narratives that persist for centuries. When emperors die as prisoners of foreign conquerors, do they sacrifice their divinity or prove its eternal nature? You're standing in Munich's People's Court on April 1st, 1924. Where Adolf Hitler transforms his treason trial into propaganda platform while sympathetic judges impose lenient sentences that treat armed rebellion as patriotic misunderstanding rather than criminal violence. Hitler, General Ludendorff, and other Nazi conspirators used their trial for attempting to overthrow the Bavarian government as opportunity to spread their message of German nationalism and anti-Semitism, while democratic institutions fail to recognize the deadly threat posed by fascist ideology. The courtroom becomes theater where failed putschists present themselves as German heroes fighting against international Jewish conspiracy and communist subversion, while newspaper coverage spreads their message throughout Germany and transforms obscure agitators into national figures. The lenient sentences demonstrate how democratic institutions can be manipulated by extremists who exploit legal procedures to legitimize violent ideologies while portraying themselves as victims of unjust persecution. The trial's outcome transforms Hitler from failed revolutionary into political martyr, whose message of hatred and revenge appeals to Germans humiliated by military defeat and seeking scapegoats for their suffering. When democratic courts treat fascist revolutionaries as patriots rather than criminals, do they preserve justice or enable future tyranny through legal legitimization of violent extremism? You're standing in Place de la Révolution on July 17, 1794, where 16 Carmelite nuns climb the scaffold singing the Veni Creator Spiritus, their voices growing fainter as each sister faces the guillotine in one of the Revolution's most haunting mass executions. The Carmelite community of Compiègne, led by their prioress Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, had refused to take the constitutional oath required of all religious orders, choosing martyrdom over abandoning their vows to God and their loyalty to Rome. Revolutionary authorities condemned them for maintaining correspondence with émigré priests and refusing to embrace republican virtues over divine obedience. The crowd falls unusually silent as each nun approaches the blade while her sisters continue their hymn, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that transforms political execution into religious theater. Their collective sacrifice shocks even hardened Parisians, occurring just 10 days before Robespierre's own death ends the terror's bloodiest phase. The nuns' serene acceptance of death while singing sacred music becomes a powerful symbol of faith triumphing over revolutionary violence, inspiring centuries of Catholic martyrdom literature. When religious communities choose collective martyrdom over individual survival, do they achieve earthly defeat or spiritual victory? You're standing outside Cook County Jail in Chicago on November 11, 1887, where 4 anarchist labor organizers face the gallows for a bombing they likely didn't commit, becoming international symbols of workers' rights and judicial persecution. August spies Albert Parsons, Adolf Fischer, and George Engel climbed the scaffold after being convicted of conspiracy in the Haymarket Square bombing that killed 7 policemen during a peaceful labor demonstration demanding the 8-hour workday. The crowd includes both supporters who see them as martyrs for workers' rights and opponents who view them as dangerous foreign radicals threatening American stability. Spies declares, There will come a time when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today. As the trapdoors open beneath them, their deaths galvanize international labor movements and establish May Day as a global workers' holiday commemorating their sacrifice. When workers' advocates die for others' violence, do they become martyrs for justice or victims of fear? You're standing on the slopes of Mount Shiroyama on September 24, 1877, where Japan's greatest samurai chooses seppuku over surrender, ending both his rebellion and the 1,000-year tradition of warrior rule in rapidly modernizing Japan. Saigo Takamori, the great Saigo who helped overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate but opposed the new government's westernization policies, prepares for ritual suicide as imperial troops surround his final stronghold after months of desperate fighting. The former samurai-turned-rebel leader had sparked the Satsuma Rebellion to preserve traditional warrior values against Western influence, railways, and modern conscript armies that made his sword-wielding followers obsolete. His loyal retainer assists with the ceremonial beheading after Saigo disembowels himself, according to ancient Bushido tradition, while government forces observe respectfully from a distance. His death marks the end of samurai political power and armed resistance to modernization. Yet his principled sacrifice transforms him into a folk hero representing authentic Japanese values against foreign corruption. The Meiji government pardons him posthumously, recognizing that his honorable death serves their narrative of loyal opposition better than his living rebellion. When ancient warriors choose ritual death over modern surrender, do they preserve honor or become relics? You're standing outside Geneva's city walls on October 27, 1553, where the Spanish physician and theologian faces Protestant flames for questioning fundamental Christian doctrine, proving that Reformed Christianity can be as intolerant as Catholic orthodoxy. Miguel Serveto, the brilliant anatomist who discovered pulmonary circulation and challenged Trinitarian theology in his writings, burned slowly on green wood as John Calvin's Geneva demonstrates its commitment to doctrinal purity through public execution of heretics. The crowd includes both supporters of Calvin's strict religious rule and critics who question whether Protestant reformers should execute fellow Christians for theological disagreements. Servetus had fled Catholic persecution in Spain only to find Protestant intolerance equally deadly, as his writings denying the Trinity and infant baptism offended all established Christian churches. The execution takes over 30 minutes due to the deliberately slow-burning wood, allowing the condemned man's screams to echo across Lake Geneva as a warning to other theological innovators. His death shocks European humanists and contributes to growing demands for religious tolerance, while Calvin defends the execution as necessary to protect Christian truth from dangerous error. When Protestant reformers burn fellow reformers for doctrinal differences, do they defend truth or replicate Catholic tyranny? You're standing outside Kilby Prison in Alabama during the 1930s, where 9 African-American teenagers face death sentences for allegedly raping 2 white women, becoming symbols of racial injustice in the American South despite avoiding actual execution. Charlie Weems, Ozzie Powell, Clarence Norris, Andrew Wright, Leroy Wright, Olin Montgomery, Willie Robertson, Eugene Williams, and Haywood Patterson, ranging in age from 13 to 19, endure years of legal appeals while death row waits for them in Alabama's electric chair. The crowd outside includes both white supremacists demanding their execution and civil rights activists proving their innocence through testimony that one alleged victim recanted her accusations. Their case exposes the deadly intersection of race, class, and gender in Southern justice, where black men accused of raping white women faced almost certain death regardless of evidence. International pressure from communist organizations and liberal groups ultimately saves their lives through Supreme Court appeals, that established new precedents for adequate legal defense and jury selection. Though they avoid execution, their years in prison and legal limbo demonstrate how the threat of death penalty serves as social control even when not carried out. When threatened executions become international symbols, does the death penalty's power lie in actual killing or potential killing? You're standing in Loudoun's marketplace on August 18th, 1634, where a charismatic Catholic priest faces the stake for allegedly bewitching an entire convent of nuns, becoming history's most famous victim of mass hysteria and political conspiracy. Father Urbain Grandier, the handsome and learned priest who opposed Cardinal Richelieu's political centralization and seduced local women with his charm and intelligence, burns alive while maintaining his innocence of witchcraft charges brought by the possessed Ursuline nuns of Loudun. The crowd includes thousands of spectators who traveled from across France to witness this spectacular trial involving demonic possession, exorcisms, and sexual scandal that captivated the nation for months. The nuns' public convulsions, speaking in tongues, and accusations of sexual commerce with devils provided sensational entertainment while serving Richelieu's need to eliminate a troublesome local opponent. Grandier's torture fails to produce the expected confession, and his dignified death, while professing faith in God, creates doubts about his guilt among spectators who expected a satanic agent to curse his executioners. His case becomes a cautionary tale about the deadly combination of religious hysteria, sexual repression, and political opportunism. When priests burn for crimes that exist only in others' nightmares, does the fire consume evil or create it? You're standing outside Pottsville Prison on June 21st, 1877, where 10 Irish-American coal miners face the gallows for allegedly murdering mine bosses and strikebreakers, ending one of America's most controversial labor conspiracies. The secret society of Irish Catholic miners, organized to fight dangerous working conditions and ethnic discrimination in Pennsylvania's anthracite coal fields, goes to their deaths while maintaining the innocence of most charges brought against them by mine owners and Pinkerton detectives. The crowd includes both Irish immigrants who see them as heroes fighting oppression and native-born Americans who view them as foreign terrorists threatening law and order through violence and intimidation. Their trials relied heavily on testimony from James McParland, the Pinkerton agent who infiltrated their organization for 2 years, creating evidence that critics claim was fabricated to destroy Irish labor organizing. The simultaneous executions across multiple Pennsylvania towns demonstrate coordinated state power, crushing ethnic resistance, while survivors flee to other states to escape continued persecution. Their deaths effectively end organized Irish resistance in the coal fields, while inspiring future labor movements to avoid secret societies in favor of open unions. When ethnic workers hang for violence against industrial oppression, do they die as terrorists or freedom fighters? You're standing in Nantes Marketplace on October 26, 1440, where the former companion of Joan of Arc faces execution for the serial murder of hundreds of children, shocking medieval France with revelations of aristocratic depravity and satanic worship. Gilles de Ries, the wealthy marshal of France who fought beside the Maid of Orleans, and later turned to alchemy, black magic, and child murder, confesses publicly to killing over 100 peasant children in occult rituals designed to restore his squandered fortune through demonic power. The crowd listens in horrified silence as the once honored nobleman details his crimes, including torture, sexual abuse, and ritual sacrifice of innocents in his castle's hidden chambers. Church authorities allow him final confession and absolution, demonstrating mercy toward a repentant sinner, while civil courts condemn his body to death by hanging and burning. His trial establishes legal precedents for prosecuting serial murder, while his confessions inspire centuries of legends about aristocratic evil and the corrupting power of wealth and privilege. His transformation from war hero to child killer becomes a medieval morality tale about the fragility of honor and the depths of human depravity. When war heroes become child killers, does their fall represent personal corruption or universal human potential for evil? You're standing outside Manchester's New Bailey prison on November 23, 1867, where 3 Irish Republicans face the gallows for killing a police sergeant during a rescue attempt, becoming the first martyrs of modern Irish nationalism. William Philip Allen, Michael Larkin, and Michael O'Brien, members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood known as the Fenians, walked to their deaths for their role in the rescue of Fenian leaders from a police van that resulted in Sergeant Charles Brett's accidental death. The crowd includes both English citizens who support their execution for murder and Irish immigrants who see them as heroes fighting for their homeland's freedom from British colonial rule. Their trial focused on technical legal questions about intent and responsibility, but the real issue was whether Irish Republicans had the right to use violence against British authority in pursuit of national independence. The 3 men die while singing Irish songs and declaring their loyalty to the Irish Republic, transforming an ordinary criminal case into a cause célèbre for Irish nationalism. Their martyrdom inspires decades of Republican ballads, commemorative ceremonies, and continued violence in pursuit of Irish freedom. When nationalists die for accidental killings during liberation struggles, do they become martyrs for freedom or victims of misdirected violence? You're standing on Lancaster's Gallows Hill on August 20th, 1612, where 10 members of feuding families face hanging for witchcraft in England's most famous witch trial outside Salem, proving how personal grudges could transform into supernatural accusations. The Demdike and Chattox families, poor residents of Pendle Forest who had quarreled over stolen property and unpaid debts for generations, now climb the gallows as witches after their own children testify against parents and grandparents in court proceedings that shock contemporary observers. The crowd includes both local residents who genuinely believe in the family's magical powers and skeptical observers who recognize the trials as results of economic desperation and family dysfunction rather than supernatural evil or diabolic conspiracy. The hangings eliminate 2 entire family networks while demonstrating how witchcraft accusations could settle personal scores and redistribute property among England's rural poor through legal mechanisms designed to combat imaginary crimes. The Pendle executions become England's most documented witch trials, while proving that supernatural fears often masked very earthly motives of revenge, greed, and social control. When entire families hang for witchcraft, born from personal feuds and economic desperation, do the gallows execute supernatural evil or reveal the natural power of human hatred and greed? You're standing in the ditch outside Balliol College, Oxford, on October 16, 1555, where 2 Protestant bishops face Catholic flames in Queen Mary's campaign to restore England to Roman obedience through public terror and religious spectacle. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, the elderly reformers who helped establish English Protestantism under Henry VIII and Edward VI, burned together at a single stake while hundreds of Oxford scholars and townspeople witnessed their martyrdom. The crowd includes both Catholics, celebrating the destruction of heretics, and secret Protestants, memorizing every detail for future Protestant propaganda about Catholic cruelty. Latimer encourages his younger companion with the prophetic words, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Their deaths become centerpieces of John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, the most influential Protestant text after the Bible, inspiring centuries of English anti-Catholic sentiment. Mary's execution campaign backfires completely, making Protestant martyrs into national heroes while earning her the permanent nickname Bloody Mary in English popular memory. When queens burn bishops to restore old faith, do the flames light religious revival or religious hatred? You're standing in Constantinople's courthouse square in August 1919, where Ottoman military tribunals publicly execute Young Turk leaders for organizing systematic deportation and massacre of Armenian civilians during World War I. Mehmet Kemal Bey, Nazim Bey, and other Committee of Union and Progress officials climb the gallows before crowds that include both Turkish nationalists defending their leaders and Armenian survivors demanding justice for family members murdered during forced deportations. The trials occur under Allied occupation, with Ottoman authorities forced to prosecute their own former officials for crimes against humanity, while Turkish public opinion remains divided between shame for wartime atrocities and anger at victors' justice imposed by foreign powers. The public executions demonstrate international determination to punish systematic murder, while showing how defeated governments can be compelled to execute their own leaders to satisfy foreign demands for accountability. These hangings establish precedents for prosecuting genocide as international crime while creating nationalist martyrs who inspire future Turkish resistance movements. When governments publicly execute their own officials for genocide under foreign pressure, do they achieve justice or create martyrs for nationalist resistance against international law? You're standing in Tyburn on October 20th, 1681, where the Archbishop of Armagh and his companions face the traitor's death for allegedly plotting to massacre Protestants and restore Catholic rule to Ireland through French invasion. Oliver Plunkett, the Catholic primate of all Ireland, endures the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering alongside other Irish nobles accused of participating in the fabricated popish plot that terrorized England during the Exclusion Crisis. The crowd includes many who genuinely believe in the Catholic conspiracy to murder King Charles II and establish papal supremacy, while others recognize the executions as political theater designed to prevent Catholic succession. Plunkett maintains his innocence throughout the prolonged execution, praying in Latin while executioners disembowel him alive according to the ancient ritual for high treason. His death represents the climax of anti-Catholic hysteria that swept England after Titus Oates fabricated evidence of papal plots, leading to the execution of 35 innocent Catholics. The Archbishop's martyrdom galvanizes Irish Catholic resistance while providing Protestant England with a satisfying spectacle of justice against alleged foreign treachery. When fabricated conspiracies lead to real executions, do the victims die for imaginary crimes or actual religious differences? You're standing on Tower Hill on August 18, 1746, where two Scottish nobles face the axe for supporting Charles Edward Stuart's attempt to restore the Catholic Stuarts to the British throne through Highland Rebellion. Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, and Arthur Elphinstone, Lord Balmerino, climb the scaffold as the last peers executed for treason in British history, their deaths marking the final chapter of Jacobite dreams and Highland independence. The crowd includes both English spectators celebrating the end of Scottish rebellion and Scottish sympathizers mourning the destruction of their ancient clan system and Catholic cause. Lord Lovat, aged 80, jokes with the executioner about the sharpness of his axe while examining the block that will receive his head, maintaining Highland dignity even in defeat. Their executions follow the brutal suppression of Highland culture after Culloden, including bans on tartan, bagpipes, and clan gatherings that aimed to destroy Scottish identity forever. The deaths of these elderly lords symbolize the end of feudal Scotland and the beginning of forced integration into British imperial system through cultural genocide and aristocratic extinction. When ancient lords die for lost causes, do they preserve their people's honor or seal their cultural destruction? You're standing in fields across Germany during May 1525, where princes and bishops systematically execute over 20,000 peasants who dared demand religious freedom, economic justice, and an end to serfdom in history's largest popular uprising before the French Revolution. Thomas Münzer's followers and tens of thousands of other peasant rebels face mass execution by hanging, beheading, and burning, as German nobility demonstrates that demands for Christian equality and social justice constitute unforgivable challenges to God-ordained hierarchy and aristocratic privilege. The executions occur in village squares, market towns, and open fields throughout the Holy Roman Empire as princes compete to demonstrate their ruthlessness in suppressing popular demands for basic human rights and religious reform that threaten established social order. The mass killings eliminate organized peasant resistance for centuries, while proving that established authority will use unlimited violence to preserve systems of exploitation and inequality that benefit wealthy elites at the expense of suffering masses. The systematic slaughter transforms religious reformation into social revolution while demonstrating how spiritual movements become political threats when they demand earthly justice alongside heavenly salvation. When 20,000 peasants die for demanding Christian justice and social equality based on gospel teachings, do they prove revolution's futility or reveal authority's terror of genuine equality? You're standing in the forests near Bucharest in December 1476, where Wallachhia's most feared ruler meets his end not through his signature method of impalement, but by Turkish blades, ending a reign that defined cruelty as statecraft. Vlad III. Dracula, the prince who impaled thousands of Ottoman invaders, corrupt nobles, and disobedient peasants on wooden stakes throughout his territories, dies fighting Turkish forces trying to reclaim his throne for the third time in his tumultuous career. The man who created forests of impaled bodies as psychological warfare against Ottoman expansion now becomes just another battlefield casualty, his head sent to Constantinople as proof of his death. Local boyars who survived his reign of terror celebrate quietly while peasants mourn the loss of a ruler who protected them from foreign invasion and domestic corruption through absolutely ruthless methods. His death allows Ottoman expansion into Wallachia, while ending the most systematic use of impalement as public execution and political intimidation in European history. Legends grow around his cruelty, eventually transforming the historical prince into the fictional vampire Dracula, immortalizing his brutality and supernatural form. When rulers who execute thousands die ordinarily in battle, does their mundane death diminish or enhance their legendary cruelty? You're standing outside Kamiti Prison in Nairobi on May 18, 1957, where Dedan Kimathi and other Mau Mau commanders face British gallows for leading the armed struggle against colonial rule in Kenya. Dedan Kimathi Wachuri, the field marshal of the Land and Freedom Army who organized Kikuyu resistance against British settlers and their African collaborators, walks to his execution while maintaining that his fight for Kenyan independence was just and necessary. The crowd outside includes both British settlers celebrating the death of their most feared enemy and African supporters who see him as a hero fighting for stolen ancestral lands and political freedom. His capture and trial revealed the extent of British torture and detention camps designed to break Kikuyu resistance through systematic brutality and psychological warfare. The execution occurs during the height of the emergency, when Britain suspended civil liberties and detained over 1 million Kenyans in concentration camps to preserve white settler dominance. Kimathi's death fails to end the rebellion, but transforms him into a martyr for African nationalism, whose sacrifice inspires the eventual achievement of Kenyan independence. 6 years later. Kimathe's death fails to end the rebellion, but transforms him into a martyr for African nationalism, whose sacrifice inspires the eventual achievement of Kenyan independence 6 years later. When colonial subjects die fighting for their own land, do they die as terrorists or as patriots defending their homeland? You're standing at Tyburn on May 4th, 1535, where 3 Carthusian priors face hanging, drawing, and quartering for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England instead of the Pope. John Houghton, Robert Lawrence, and Augustine Webster, the monastic leaders who chose martyrdom over compromising their religious vows, endure the traitor's death while maintaining their loyalty to papal authority and Catholic doctrine. The crowd includes many who admire their principled stand against royal tyranny over conscience, while others support the king's break with Rome and view the monks as dangerous foreign agents. The Carthusians' spectacular public deaths shock London citizens accustomed to seeing common criminals executed, but unprepared for the sight of holy men dying horribly for religious conviction. Their executions mark the beginning of Henry's systematic destruction of English monasticism, and the execution of anyone who refuses to accept his religious supremacy. Thomas More and John Fisher watch from the tower, knowing they face similar fates for similar refusal to compromise their consciences to royal will. When holy men die horribly for refusing royal religious authority, do they prove faith's power or reveal tyranny's reach? You're standing outside various Indian prisons during the 1830s, where British colonial authorities systematically execute hundreds of members of the Thuggee cult who ritually murdered travelers as sacrifices to the goddess Kali. The secret society of professional assassins who strangled lone travelers with silk scarves while invoking divine protection from Kali face mass execution as British officials under William Sleeman conduct one of history's largest police operations against organized crime. The crowds include both Indians grateful for protection from highway murder and those who question British justice applied to traditional religious practices they don't understand. Colonial authorities present the campaign as civilizing mission against barbaric Indian customs, while some scholars suggest the British exaggerated Thuggee crimes to justify increased control over Indian society and commerce. The executions eliminate an ancient criminal network that may have killed thousands of travelers over centuries, but they also demonstrate British willingness to use mass execution to reshape Indian society according to European moral standards. The campaign transforms isolated criminal gangs into symbols of Oriental barbarism that justified continued colonial rule. When colonial powers execute traditional criminals for religious murder, do they dispense justice or impose foreign morality? You're standing in various German towns during 1525, where nobles and church authorities execute the leaders of history's largest peasant uprising through the most brutal methods available to demonstrate the price of challenging the social order. Thomas Münzer, the radical preacher who convinced German peasants that God supported their rebellion against noble oppression and church corruption, dies under torture in Mühlhausen, along with thousands of his followers who dared demand economic justice and religious reform. The crowds include both surviving peasants forced to witness the executions as warnings and nobles celebrating the restoration of traditional hierarchy through spectacular violence. The peasant leaders face drawing and quartering, burning, impalement, and other elaborate deaths designed to terrify potential future rebels while entertaining their social superiors with creative cruelty. Their deaths end the largest popular uprising in European history before the French Revolution, killing over 100,000 peasants and ensuring that German social structure remains unchanged for centuries. The brutal suppression of peasant demands for basic rights and religious freedom demonstrates the lengths to which established authority will go to preserve inequality and privilege. When peasants die horribly for demanding justice, Do they prove revolution's futility or authorities' desperation to preserve inequality? You're standing outside Dorchester Crown Court on March 19, 1834, where 6 agricultural laborers face transportation to Australia for the crime of forming a trade union, sparking the birth of organized labor movements across Britain. George Lovelace, James Lovelace, Thomas Stanfield, John Stanfield, James Hammett, and James Brine, the Methodist farm workers who dared organize for fair wages in rural Dorset, received 7-year sentences to Van Diemen's Land for administering illegal oaths to union members. The crowd includes both local farmers celebrating the destruction of worker organization and sympathetic laborers who recognize their own fate in these sentences. Their crime was meeting under an old oak tree to form the Friendly Society of Agricultural Laborers, seeking to raise wages from 9 shillings to 10 shillings per week through collective bargaining. The judge uses an obscure law about secret oaths to crush rural unionism, but the harsh sentences backfire spectacularly, generating massive protests across Britain and transforming 6 obscure farm workers into martyrs for workers' rights. Their case establishes the principle that workers have the right to organize, making their punishment the foundation of modern trade unionism. When workers face exile for demanding fair wages, do they lose their freedom or win the foundation for future liberation? You're standing in Beijing's execution ground on February 21, 1901, where Qing dynasty authorities behead the leaders of the Boxer Rebellion under pressure from 8 foreign powers seeking revenge for the siege of their legations. The crowd includes both Chinese citizens angry at foreign domination and foreign residents demanding blood for the deaths of missionaries and diplomats during the 55-day siege. The Boxers had practiced martial arts they believed made them bulletproof while attacking foreign railways, telegraphs, and churches in a desperate attempt to purge China of Western influence and Christian conversion. Their executions satisfy foreign demands for justice while humiliating the Qing dynasty, which must punish its own subjects to appease the very powers the Boxers fought against. The beheadings mark China's deepest submission to foreign control, spurring nationalist movements that eventually overthrow both the Qing dynasty and foreign domination. When rebels die for fighting foreign domination, do their executions prove their failure or their nation's surrender? You're standing on the parade ground at Delhi in September 1857, where British forces execute sepoy mutineers by tying them to cannon mouths and firing, creating spectacular military executions designed to terrorize the Indian population into submission. Mangal Pandey's fellow rebels who killed British officers and proclaimed restoration of Mughal rule faced the traditional punishment of being blown from guns, as British commanders deliberately choose this method to demonstrate their mastery of Indian customs while showing their willingness to use extreme violence. The crowds include both British residents celebrating brutal justice against treacherous natives and Indian spectators forced to witness the price of challenging white supremacy through military rebellion against colonial rule. The cannon executions eliminate immediate military resistance while creating martyrs whose sacrifice inspires future independence movements that remember these soldiers as the first freedom fighters against foreign domination. The spectacular nature of these deaths ensures they become legendary symbols of both British cruelty and Indian courage, inspiring decades of resistance literature and nationalist mythology. When imperial powers execute rebels using traditional punishments, do they demonstrate cultural knowledge or reveal their capacity for spectacular cruelty against subject peoples? You're standing at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, on January 30th, 1838, where Osceola and other Seminole leaders die in captivity after being tricked into surrender under a flag of truce, ending Native American resistance in Florida through betrayal rather than battle. Osceola, the charismatic war chief who led Seminole and escaped slave resistance against American expansion into the Florida Everglades, dies of illness in prison while crowds of curious Americans visit to see the famous savage who defied the U.S. Army for years. The crowd includes both soldiers who fought against him and civilians fascinated by the romantic figure of the noble warrior defending his homeland against overwhelming odds. His capture through treachery during supposed peace negotiations shocks even American officers who consider such methods dishonorable. But military necessity trumps military honor in dealing with inconvenient Native resistance. Osceola's death removes the most effective Native American leader of the Second Seminole War, allowing American forces to drive most remaining Seminoles deeper into the swamps or force their removal to Oklahoma reservations. His martyrdom transforms a military defeat into a moral victory that inspires future Native American resistance movements while shaming Americans about their treatment of indigenous peoples. When Native chiefs die as prisoners after fighting for their ancestral lands, do they lose their territory or gain immortal justice? You're standing outside York Castle on January 8, 1813, where 17 textile workers face the gallows for destroying the industrial machinery that eliminated their skilled jobs, becoming martyrs for workers displaced by technological change. The crowd includes both mill owners celebrating the end of machine breaking and unemployed workers mourning the loss of men who fought technological unemployment through direct action. The Luddites had conducted nighttime raids across Yorkshire and Lancashire, destroying machinery while disguised and using assumed names like King Lud to protect their identities from government spies and military patrols. Their executions end organized resistance to industrial mechanization, while establishing the principle that destroying private property merits death, regardless of workers' economic desperation or social displacement. The hangings fail to stop technological progress, but transform machine breakers into symbols of human dignity against industrial dehumanization, inspiring labor movements that eventually secure worker protections through legal rather than violent means. When skilled workers die for destroying the machines that replace them, do they fight progress or defend human worth? You're standing in London's Smithfield on June 15, 1381, where Richard II's forces execute leaders of the peasants' revolt after the king's promises of reform turn into royal vengeance against social revolution. The crowd includes both nobles celebrating the restoration of social order and surviving peasants forced to witness the price of challenging their betters through violence and political demands. The rebels had burned manor houses, executed royal officials, and opened prisons while chanting John Ball's revolutionary rhyme, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Their executions restore traditional hierarchy while demonstrating royal duplicity, as Richard's promises of freedom prove worthless once military force crushes peasant power. The brutal suppression teaches English peasants that social change requires royal permission. But their sacrifice plants seeds of future democratic movements that eventually achieve many of their demands through parliamentary rather than revolutionary means. When peasants die for demanding equality, do their deaths prove hierarchy's permanence or plant democracy's seeds? You're standing on a small island in the Seine on March 18, 1314, where the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar faces slow burning for alleged heresy, ending the richest and most powerful military order of medieval Christianity. The crowd includes both Parisians who believe the accusations and those who recognize royal greed disguised as religious purification, watching nervously as one of Europe's most respected institutions dies in flames. The Templars had accumulated vast wealth through banking, land ownership, and donations from nobles seeking salvation through financing holy war, making them irresistible targets for debt-ridden monarchs. De Molay's final curse, predicting that Philip and Pope Clement V will join him within a year, proves prophetic when both die mysteriously soon after, transforming his execution into legendary prophecy. The destruction of the Templars eliminates medieval Europe's most successful military corporation while demonstrating how religious accusations can justify political theft. When warrior monks burn for imaginary heresies, do they die for their sins or their wealth? You're standing in Salem's Courthouse Square on September 19, 1692, where Giles Corey, the 80-year-old farmer accused of witchcraft, dies under heavy stones rather than enter a plea, becoming the only victim of judicial torture in American colonial history. Giles Corey endures pressing with large stones for 2 days while refusing to say guilty or not guilty to charges of practicing witchcraft. Knowing that conviction means death while maintaining his silence preserves his property for his heirs. The crowd watches in horrified fascination as the old man's ribs crack under increasing weight, while he gasps only more weight in response to demands for a plea. His wife Martha had already hanged as a witch, and Corey recognizes that the court's predetermined guilt makes trial pointless, choosing instead to die in a way that protects his family's inheritance from seizure. His gruesome death shocks Salem residents into questioning the witch trial's legitimacy, as even supporters of the prosecutions find his torture excessive and potentially illegal. The pressing becomes the witch trial's most infamous execution method, inspiring legends about Corey's curse on Salem and sheriffs' families, while demonstrating how legal procedures can become instruments of pure torture. When old farmers choose crushing over corrupt courts, do they die as heroes or as victims of judicial madness? You're standing in Beijing's execution ground during 1813, where Qing dynasty authorities carry out the death of 1,000 cuts on leaders of the White Lotus Rebellion who proclaimed the imminent end of the world and the beginning of Buddha's kingdom on earth. The crowd includes both government officials celebrating the end of heterodox religion and believers who see their leaders' suffering as proof of cosmic transformation and divine justice. The White Lotus sect had combined Buddhist prophecy, Taoist magic, and popular discontent into a revolutionary movement promising salvation through rebellion against Manchu rule and corrupt officials. Their executions involve ritual dismemberment designed to destroy both body and soul, preventing reincarnation while entertaining spectators with the slow death of dangerous fanatics. The brutal suppression temporarily ends millenarian rebellion, but drives heterodox religion underground, where it continues inspiring resistance movements that eventually overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish republican government. When religious rebels face dismemberment for proclaiming heaven on earth, do they die as fanatics or as prophets of change? You're standing against the cemetery wall in Paris on May 28, 1871, where 147 communards face firing squads as government forces end the world's first socialist revolution through mass execution and urban warfare. The last defenders of the Paris Commune, including women fighters, National Guard officers, and working-class revolutionaries, fall before government rifles in Père Lachaise Cemetery after 2 months of siege and civil war that divided France between socialist workers and conservative bourgeoisie. The crowd consists entirely of government troops and bourgeois Parisians celebrating the end of working-class rule, as no supporters survive to witness their comrades' final sacrifice for social revolution. The Commune had abolished night work in bakeries, established workers' cooperatives, and separated church from state while defending Paris against both German occupation and French government assault. The wall executions climax Bloody Week, during which government forces kill an estimated 17,000 to 20,000 communards in street fighting and summary executions throughout Paris. The mass shootings create the modern tradition of socialist martyrdom, while inspiring international workers' movements that remember the Commune as the first glimpse of proletarian democracy and revolutionary government. When workers die for creating the first socialist state, do they fail in revolution or succeed in inspiration? You're standing in Nanjing during the 1850s, where Hong Xiuquan, who believes he is the younger brother of Jesus Christ, oversees mass executions of Qing officials and Confucian scholars in his attempt to establish God's kingdom on earth through revolutionary Christianity. Hong Xiuquan's Taiping Rebellion creates history's deadliest civil war, killing over 20 million people as his Christian-inspired movement seeks to overthrow the Qing dynasty and replace Confucian society with biblical communism and gender equality. The crowd includes both devoted followers who see their leader as divine and terrified captives forced to witness systematic elimination of traditional Chinese culture through public beheadings and mass drownings. The Taiping courts execute anyone caught with Confucian books, practicing traditional religion, or maintaining loyalty to the imperial system while establishing new laws based on Hong's visions of Christian revelation mixed with Chinese folk religion. The executions aim to purify society of demonic influences while demonstrating divine judgment against corrupt officials and false teachings that have led China astray from God's will. The rebellion's eventual suppression by combined Qing and Western forces ends the bloodiest religious war in human history while proving that even divine missions can become instruments of mass destruction. When self-proclaimed messiahs execute millions for heavenly kingdoms, do they serve God or become the devils they claim to fight? You're standing in Wenceslas Square on August 21, 1968. Where Soviet tanks crushed Czechoslovak hopes for democratic socialism, executing reformers not through formal trials, but through military occupation that ends the brief flowering of political freedom. Alexander Dubček's government of socialism with a human face dies under Warsaw Pact invasion as 200,000 troops occupy Prague to prevent the spread of democratic ideas throughout the communist bloc, while citizens throw rocks at tanks and burn Soviet flags in futile gestures of resistance. The crowd includes students, workers, and intellectuals who had believed communism could be reformed from within, now watching their dreams die under tank treads as Soviet forces arrest reform leaders and install hardline puppets. The occupation executes the Prague Spring without formal executions, using military force to demonstrate that no communist nation can choose its own path toward freedom and democracy. Protesters who resist face imprisonment, exile, or mysterious deaths that serve as warnings to others about the price of challenging Soviet authority over Eastern Europe. The crushing of Czechoslovak reform inspires future resistance movements while proving that communist unity requires suppression of national independence and democratic aspirations. When democratic dreams die under foreign tanks, do the victims perish from bullets or from the death of hope itself? You're standing in various Chinese villages during 1900, where Christian missionaries and their Chinese converts face execution by Boxer rebels who blame foreign religion for China's humiliation by Western powers and natural disasters. Over 200 Protestant missionaries, 30,000 Chinese Christians, and numerous Catholic priests die during the anti-foreign uprising as Boxer societies practice martial arts they believe make them bulletproof while systematically hunting down followers of the foreign devil's religion. The crowds consist of Chinese peasants and urban workers who genuinely believe Christianity has angered traditional gods and brought drought, floods, and military defeats through spiritual pollution of sacred Chinese soil. Missionary families face torture, burning, and beheading, while Chinese converts endure even worse fates as traitors who abandoned their ancestors for foreign gods, with entire Christian villages massacred during the rebellion's peak. The executions aim to purify China of foreign influence and restore harmony between heaven and earth by eliminating Western religion and its Chinese collaborators. The missionary martyrdoms provide Western powers with moral justification for military intervention, while inspiring increased Christian evangelization that transforms persecution into proof of faith's truth and power. When foreign missionaries die for spreading alien gods, do they become martyrs for faith or symbols of cultural invasion? You're standing on Culloden Moor on April 16, 1746, where Highland clans supporting Bonnie Prince Charlie face systematic slaughter during and after the battle that ends Scottish independence dreams and begins cultural genocide against clan society. Wounded Jacobite soldiers receive no quarter as British forces bayonet survivors lying on the battlefield, while captured clan leaders face hanging, beheading, or transportation to American colonies as punishment for supporting Catholic Stuart restoration to the British throne. The crowd includes English soldiers celebrating victory over Scottish rebellion and Highland families mourning the destruction of their ancient way of life through military defeat and subsequent cultural suppression. Government forces burn clan territories, ban Highland dress, prohibit bagpipes and Gaelic language, and execute chiefs who refuse to swear loyalty to Protestant Hanoverian rule over traditional Catholic Stuart claims. The post-battle executions eliminate Highland military power, while the cultural prohibitions execute Scottish identity itself, forcing proud warriors to become farmers and emigrants who preserve their traditions only in distant lands. The systematic destruction of clan society transforms military victory into ethnic cleansing that shapes Scottish identity for centuries while creating diaspora communities worldwide. When ancient clans die for lost causes, does their defeat end their culture or scatter it like seeds across the world? You're standing in university courtyards across China during 1966 to 1976, where teenage Red Guard students systematically beat their professors to death during struggle sessions, designed to destroy traditional education and eliminate intellectual opposition to Mao's revolutionary ideology. Professor Bian Zhongyun, headmistress of Beijing Girls' Middle School, dies from prolonged student beatings while thousands of other educators, scholars, and cultural figures face similar execution by their own pupils in scenes that shock even hardened observers of political violence and revolutionary extremism throughout Chinese society. The crowds consist entirely of teenage students who transform classrooms into execution chambers, while chanting revolutionary slogans and competing to prove their loyalty to Chairman Mao through increasingly extreme acts of violence against authority figures who represent traditional Chinese educational values. Teachers kneel on broken glass while students force them to confess imaginary crimes against the people, then beat them to death with clubs, chains, and improvised weapons, while school officials watch helplessly or participate to save themselves from similar fates at student hands. The systematic executions aim to destroy China's educational system and cultural continuity completely, replacing scholarly learning with revolutionary fervor and respect for knowledge, with worship of political power and ideological purity above all human considerations. When revolutionary students execute their teachers for representing traditional knowledge and cultural authority, do they destroy education to create new learning, or simply eliminate wisdom through ideological violence? You're standing in various French cities during the 16th century, where Catholic authorities burn Protestant Huguenots at the stake for heresy, creating martyrs whose deaths fuel religious wars that tear France apart for decades. Jacques Leroux, Pierre Brulé, and thousands of French Protestants face burning, hanging, and drowning as Catholic officials attempt to eliminate Reformed religion through systematic persecution that only strengthens Huguenot resolve and international Protestant support. The crowds include both Catholic citizens celebrating the destruction of heretics and secret Protestant sympathizers who memorize details of martyrdom for underground networks that preserve Reformed faith despite royal persecution. The executions follow traditional medieval methods designed to purify souls through earthly suffering while providing public entertainment and moral education about the price of religious dissent. King Francis I and his successors authorize mass executions to demonstrate Catholic orthodoxy and prevent French fragmentation along religious lines. But the martyrdoms inspire Protestant resistance and foreign intervention that creates exactly the division they sought to prevent. The burning of Huguenots transforms religious difference into civil war, while establishing patterns of persecution and resistance that shape French identity for centuries. When kings burn their subjects for foreign faiths, do they preserve unity or create the divisions that destroy their kingdoms? You're standing in the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza during the 10th century, where Mayan priests execute losing players in the ritual ball game that recreates cosmic battles between gods and demonstrates divine favor through athletic competition. Captured warriors and elite athletes face heart extraction after losing the sacred ball game that symbolizes the sun's daily journey through the underworld, their deaths ensuring cosmic balance and agricultural fertility while entertaining spectators with displays of divine justice. The crowd includes Mayan nobles, priests, and commoners who understand the game's religious significance as more than sport, watching carefully for omens about harvest success, military victories, and divine approval of their rulers' policies. The ball court executions follow elaborate rituals designed to transform athletic defeat into religious sacrifice, with losing players sometimes volunteering for death as the ultimate honor rather than punishment for failure. The sacrificial games demonstrate Mayan beliefs about the interconnection of human society, natural cycles, and divine will, while providing rulers with spectacular methods of eliminating rivals and displaying their religious authority. The tradition continues for centuries until Spanish conquest replaces indigenous theology with Christian concepts of sacrifice and redemption. When athletic competitions become religious executions, do the games serve gods or provide rulers with entertaining methods of elimination? You're standing in Addis Ababa during 1977 and 1978, where the Derg military government executes thousands of high school and university students suspected of supporting rival revolutionary factions during Ethiopia's communist transformation. Young Ethiopians face firing squads, hanging, and torture during the Red Terror campaign that eliminates political opposition through systematic violence designed to consolidate Marxist rule under military strongman Mengistu Haile Mariam. The crowds include both government supporters, celebrating the destruction of counter-revolutionary elements, and families mourning children whose only crime was attending political meetings or distributing leaflets critical of military dictatorship. Students as young as 14 die for belonging to the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party or other groups that challenge the Derg's monopoly on revolutionary legitimacy, while their bodies fill the streets as warnings to other young people about the price of political activism. The executions aim to terrorize intellectual opposition while demonstrating that even communist revolutions can devour their own children when ideological purity becomes more important than human life. The Red Terror eliminates an entire generation of educated Ethiopians while proving that revolutionary governments can become as oppressive as the imperial regimes they replace. When revolutionary governments execute their own students, do they protect the revolution or destroy its future? You're standing along the deportation routes through Syria's harsh desert in 1915, where Ottoman authorities systematically execute over 1 million Armenians through forced marches designed to appear like population transfer while ensuring death through calculated exposure and deliberate violence. Armenian intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders face public hanging in Constantinople while ordinary families endure death marches into waterless desert regions where most die of thirst, hunger, and exposure, as Ottoman officials claim to relocate dangerous populations away from war zones during World War I emergency conditions. The crowds witnessing these deportations consist mainly of Turkish and Kurdish villagers who sometimes help the suffering deportees, but more often rob, rape, and murder them with explicit government encouragement, while Ottoman soldiers supervise the systematic killing while maintaining official denial of genocidal intent throughout the process. The deportation routes themselves become execution chambers stretching across hundreds of miles, with Armenian corpses marking the path of systematic extermination, disguised as military necessity and population management during wartime emergency situations. International observers document these atrocities while Ottoman authorities maintain they are simply moving disloyal populations to safer areas, creating propaganda battles that continue for over a century, while survivors preserve memories of systematic murder disguised as humanitarian relocation. When governments execute entire peoples through forced marches disguised as protective relocation during wartime, do they commit military necessity or perfect the methods of invisible genocide through bureaucratic murder? You're standing in various Soviet labor camps during Stalin's purges of the 1930s, where millions of prisoners face execution for fabricated crimes of sabotage, espionage, and counter-revolutionary activity in the world's largest system of judicial murder. Nikolai Bukharin, Grigory Zinoviev, and millions of ordinary Soviet citizens face shooting after-show trials that demonstrate Stalin's power to transform loyalty into treason and friends into enemies through forced confessions extracted by torture and threats against family members. The crowds consist entirely of NKVD officers, camp guards, and other prisoners, forced to witness executions designed to terrorize survivors while eliminating anyone who might challenge Stalin's absolute authority over Soviet society. The camp executions follow quotas set by Moscow, with regional officials required to arrest and execute specific numbers of enemies of the people, regardless of actual guilt or innocence, transforming law enforcement into systematic murder. Most victims die for imaginary crimes, their only real offense being potential obstacles to Stalin's paranoid vision of perfect communist society purged of all possible opposition. The executions eliminate potential resistance while creating a society based on fear, where survival depends on absolute obedience to arbitrary power that can declare anyone an enemy at any moment. Hey friends, if you love this series, exploring history's most complex and troubling chapters, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that help us understand humanity's darkest periods and greatest lessons. You're standing atop Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor during 1507, where Aztec priests conduct the new fire ceremony by executing captured warriors to ensure the sun continues its journey across the sky and the world doesn't end in darkness. Captured eagle and jaguar warriors from rival city-states climb the pyramid steps, knowing their deaths will feed Huitzilopochtli and maintain cosmic balance, while crowds below witness the transformation of military prisoners into divine offerings that prevent universal destruction. The ceremony occurs every 52 years when Aztec calendars align, requiring mass human sacrifice to convince the gods to grant another cycle of time rather than allowing the world to end in eternal night and chaos. Priests perform heart extractions with obsidian knives while victims remain conscious, believing their sacrifice prevents cosmic catastrophe and ensures continued existence for their families and communities. The ritual transforms individual death into universal salvation, while demonstrating Aztec beliefs about human responsibility for maintaining divine favor through spectacular offerings that prove worthiness for continued existence. When empires execute prisoners to prevent the end of the world, Do they demonstrate religious devotion or political control through sacred terror? You're standing in Tabriz's public square on July 9, 1850, where the Bab, founder of the Baha'i faith, faces a firing squad for claiming to be the promised Mahdi and herald of a new divine revelation that challenges Islamic orthodoxy. Shaheed Ali Muhammad Shirazi, known as the Bab, meaning gate, stands before 750 Armenian soldiers ordered to execute him for heresy, apostasy, and disturbing public order through his claims of divine mission and progressive religious teachings. The crowd includes both Muslim clerics celebrating the destruction of dangerous innovation and secret followers who see their prophet's martyrdom as proof of his divine calling. The first volley of musket fire miraculously cuts the ropes binding the Bab without harming him, allowing him to escape briefly before recapture and a second successful execution that transforms apparent divine intervention into legendary martyrdom. His death fails to destroy the Baha'i movement, but creates its foundational martyrdom narrative while demonstrating Persian authorities' determination to preserve Islamic orthodoxy against religious innovation. The execution inspires decades of Baha'i persecution throughout the Middle East while spreading the faith internationally as refugees carry their beliefs beyond Islamic lands. When new prophets die for progressive revelations, do they end their missions or begin their eternal influence? You're standing on St. George's Hill in Surrey during 1649, where Gerard Winstanley's communist experiment in collective farming faces violent destruction by local landlords who view shared property as dangerous heresy against natural hierarchy. The true levelers, known as diggers for their practice of cultivating waste and common land without permission, endure beatings, imprisonment, and execution for their belief that the earth belongs to all people equally, rather than to wealthy landowners alone. The crowd includes both sympathetic poor farmers who support communal land use and angry property owners who see collective farming as theft of their ancestral rights and dangerous precedent for social revolution. Winstanley's followers face hanging for trespass, destruction of property, and seditious assembly while maintaining that God created the earth for all humanity, not just the wealthy few who claim ownership through conquest and inheritance. Their suppression eliminates England's first communist experiment, while establishing the principle that private property rights supersede natural law and divine commandments about sharing resources. The diggers' martyrdom inspires future socialist movements, while demonstrating how economic revolution threatens established power more than political change alone. When communists die for claiming the earth belongs to everyone, do they threaten property or defend natural law? You're standing on the shores of the Black Sea in 1864, where Russian forces complete the genocide of Circassian people through mass deportation that kills hundreds of thousands while claiming to pacify the Caucasus region for imperial expansion. Prince Karandiko Berzeg and other Circassian leaders face execution or exile as their entire nation disappears through systematic killing, forced marches, and deportation to Ottoman territories where most refugees die of disease and starvation. The deportation ships become floating execution chambers, as overcrowded vessels carry dying families away from their ancestral mountains, while Russian settlers claim the emptied lands for agricultural development. The Circassian resistance had lasted over a century, with mountain warriors using guerrilla tactics to defend their independence against Russian imperial expansion, but superior numbers and modern weapons eventually crush their traditional society. Russian authorities present the deportation as necessary civilization of primitive peoples, while survivors preserve memories of genocide through oral traditions that testify to systematic extermination disguised as population transfer. The destruction of Circassian society eliminates the last independent Muslim nation in the Caucasus, while creating diaspora communities that preserve their culture in exile. When entire peoples face deportation that becomes execution, do they die as nations or survive as eternal memories? You're standing outside Sugamo Prison on December 23, 1948, where 7 Japanese war criminals face execution after the International Military Tribunal finds them guilty of crimes against peace and humanity throughout the Pacific War. General Hideki Tojo, Foreign Minister Koki Hirota, and 5 other Japanese leaders climbed the gallows as the first International War Crimes Tribunal demonstrates that aggressive war and systematic atrocities will face justice regardless of national sovereignty or military rank. The crowd includes American occupation forces supervising the executions, and Japanese citizens divided between shame for wartime crimes and resentment against victors' justice imposed by foreign powers after military defeat. The hangings establish precedents for international criminal law, while showing that even defeated nations' highest officials cannot escape responsibility for ordering systematic violence against civilian populations during military occupation. Their deaths provide symbolic justice for victims throughout Asia, while proving that international law can transcend national boundaries when enforcing basic human rights. When international tribunals execute war criminals for systematic atrocities, do they establish universal justice or demonstrate how victorious powers impose their moral standards on defeated enemies? You're standing in the forests near Smolensk in April 1940, where Soviet NKVD forces systematically execute 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and officials to decapitate Polish society and prevent future resistance to communist rule. Polish military officers, professors, doctors, and civil servants kneel beside mass graves, while NKVD executioners shoot each man in the head with German ammunition to frame Nazi Germany for this systematic elimination of Poland's leadership class. The forest becomes a killing field, where educated Poles die not for their actions, but for their potential to lead future resistance against Soviet occupation and communist transformation of Polish society. Stalin orders this execution to ensure that post-war Poland will lack the intellectual and military leadership necessary for independent government, making it easier to install a puppet communist regime after Germany's eventual defeat. The massacre remains secret for 3 years until German forces discover the mass graves and use them for propaganda against Soviet brutality, while the Soviets maintain their innocence for 50 years despite overwhelming evidence. The delayed revelation of truth transforms hidden execution into international symbol of communist crimes against humanity while honoring victims who died simply for being educated Poles. When occupying powers execute entire leadership classes in secret forests, do they eliminate resistance or create eternal symbols of their criminality? You're standing in Nuremberg's execution chamber on June 2, 1948. Where Nazi doctors face hanging for conducting deadly medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, while claiming to advance German scientific knowledge. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and 6 other medical professionals walk to the gallows after international tribunals document their roles in hypothermia experiments, sterilization procedures, and poison gas tests on unwilling human subjects who died horrible deaths for pseudoscientific research. The witnesses include both international judges horrified by medical ethics violations and surviving victims who testified about experimental torture disguised as scientific advancement during Nazi regime. The executions establish the Nuremberg Code requiring informed consent for human experimentation, while demonstrating how healing professions can become instruments of systematic murder when medicine serves totalitarian ideology. The hanged doctors become symbols of medical corruption, while their deaths prove that claims of scientific necessity cannot justify crimes against humanity disguised as medical research. When doctors hang for experimental murder disguised as science, do they expose medicine's potential for evil, or prove that healing arts cannot survive totalitarian corruption? You're standing in the Kalahari Desert in 1904, where German colonial forces systematically drive the Herero and Nama peoples into the waterless desert to die of thirst and starvation in history's first genocide of the 20th century. General Lothar von Trotha issues his infamous extermination order, commanding German soldiers to shoot any Herero found within German territory, forcing entire tribes to flee into the desert where most die horrible deaths from dehydration and hunger. The crowds consist mainly of German settlers and colonial officials, celebrating the elimination of indigenous resistance to land seizure and mineral extraction, while surviving Herero families watch their children die in the sand. The systematic poisoning of waterholes and patrol lines preventing return transform the desert itself into an execution chamber where thousands die slowly without witnesses or graves to mark their suffering. German authorities present the campaign as necessary pacification of primitive rebels, while medical officers study skull measurements and racial characteristics of the dying, combining genocide with pseudo-scientific racism. The extermination creates legal precedents for ethnic cleansing while demonstrating how colonial expansion can justify systematic murder disguised as military necessity and racial science. When colonial powers drive indigenous peoples into deserts to die, do they eliminate obstacles to progress or commit crimes against humanity? You're standing in school courtyards across China during 1966 to 1976, where Red Guard students beat their teachers to death during struggle sessions designed to destroy traditional culture and eliminate class enemies through revolutionary violence. Professor Bian Zhongyun, the headmistress of Beijing Girls' Middle School, dies from student beatings while thousands of educators, intellectuals, and cultural figures face similar execution by their own pupils in scenes that shock even hardened observers of political violence. The crowds consist of teenage students who transform classrooms into execution chambers while chanting revolutionary slogans and competing to prove their loyalty to Chairman Mao through increasingly extreme acts of violence against authority figures. Teachers kneel on broken glass while students force them to confess imaginary crimes against the people, then beat them to death with clubs, chains, and improvised weapons, while school officials watch helplessly or participate to save themselves. The executions aim to destroy China's educational system and cultural continuity, replacing scholarly learning with revolutionary fervor and respect for knowledge with worship of political power. These student executions traumatize an entire generation, while eliminating millions of China's most educated citizens, creating intellectual wasteland that takes decades to recover from revolutionary madness. When students execute their teachers for revolutionary purity, do they destroy education or create it through violence? You're standing now in every place and time where crowds have gathered to witness death transformed into public theater, where individual suffering becomes collective spectacle, and where the powerful demonstrate their authority through carefully choreographed elimination of those who challenge, threaten, or simply inconvenience established order. From ancient Rome's crosses to revolutionary France's guillotines, from Salem's gallows to Beijing's execution grounds, the pattern remains constant. Authorities stage death as education, warning, entertainment, and proof of their power over life itself. The crowds change, sometimes celebrating, sometimes mourning, often simply watching with the fascination that draws humans to witness ultimate extremes of existence. But their presence transforms private death into public meaning. Each execution carries forward the memory of all others, creating an endless chain of spectacle that shapes how societies understand justice, power, authority, and the price of resistance. The condemned die not just for their alleged crimes, but as symbols, warnings, examples, and sacrifices to abstract principles that outlive their physical bodies. Their deaths execute not just individuals, but ideas, possibilities, and dreams that die with them, while simultaneously creating new myths, martyrdoms, and motivations for future generations. When we witness these 100 executions across time and culture, do we see humanity's cruelty or its eternal struggle between power and conscience, between order and justice, between fear and hope?